So I start my timer. Okay, so moving into chapter 10, we're going to talk about the formation of this new identity that follows the War of 1812. If you look at your objective, I'll be real honest with you. Apparently, the only thing from this chapter which they think is especially useful until we get to Jackson are the Supreme Court decisions from this era. So we will tackle those in class. I'll have you look at some actual Supreme Court majority opinions. But a lot of what you're going to see in the next couple of minutes is really background of how Jackson came to power, because Jackson's a fairly polarizing figure. And this is going to give you how it is that we traveled from Madison to Jackson. So the phrase you should associate with Monroe, you're going to always associate this with Monroe. The next president was James Monroe, and you're going to associate him with the phrase, the era of good feelings. So as the War of 1812 ends, we have a measure of peace. You're also going to see that the next president who was elected wins by a landslide. You're going to see that he wins 183 electoral votes to 34, and that's going to be that Virginia Republican James Monroe. He's going to win in 1816, and he's also going to actually run unopposed. No one is even going to run against him in 1820. The reason for that, by and large, is that the Federalists have nearly collapsed as an opposing party. One of the things that you might want to remember about John Adams is that he was a pretty unpopular president, especially the Alien Act and the Sedition Act, which a lot of people saw as the federal government really overstepping its boundaries in violating the First Amendment and not allowing people to criticize the government. He was a very unpopular president. Then you have the rise of Jefferson, who, though we criticize him now as historians, was very popular at the time. His idea of like bringing the common people in and his managing to double the size of the country. So while he was criticized by Federalists and is criticized now for his hypocrisy, he was quite popular. And then, of course, the Hartford Convention is going to put the last nail in the coffin. They're going to be seen as really disloyal when they are considering leaving the country right in the middle of a war just because it doesn't suit what their region needs. So by Federalists, they're gone, and James Monroe is going to be elected twice. The phrase era of good feelings comes from this goodwill tour that he went on. The country had been quite divided, and you're going to see that despite this goodwill tour that he takes, it's going to remain quite divided. He's going to go to the middle states and the northern states because those were places where he that were not Republican strongholds. And he's going to go on this speaking tour and this handshaking tour to try to like build some closeness between the people who are pretty divided. Remember Jefferson's inaugural address, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. Presidents tend to do this. When they get elected after a particularly vicious election or between two parties that don't like each other, the president will then turn around and try to bring the two sides together. So we call it the era of good feelings. We have this rise of American nationalism after the War of 1812 when we start to realize that we too have something to be proud of, that we've now managed to defend ourselves from Great Britain twice. So there's going to be this feeling of pride in our country that starts to permeate, which is not to say that everything was great. It wasn't. But if you're going to remember one thing about Monroe, please remember this. Take a look at the electoral map. I wanted you to see that. Remember, I mentioned 1816. It was in 1820 that he ran unopposed. In 1816, we have Rufus King as the Federalist candidate. And this picture above all others will really give you a feel of how the country is divided. We have New England in the north. We're gonna stop calling it New England and start calling it the North as we get into a more slavery, as we start paying attention to slavery. But especially New England is the only place that, of course, Delaware, where Rufus King won any electoral votes, and as you can see, he only won 16% of it. So the Federalists saw the writing on the wall, and didn't even run a candidate against the Republicans and Monroe in 1820. The other thing I want to point out to you, because we're going to talk about regions of the country on the next slide. So again, we've got New England, we've got the South, kind of the traditional South, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. I want you to remember that as the traditional South. And then we've got the West. So our Western states, we're going to talk about Kentucky as one of them, Tennessee, Indiana, Ohio. These are going to become states by 1816 through the Northwest Ordinances. So this is the West as far as like official states go. And then, of course, we have our new territories that are being developed in this territory, which has come to be purchased. So North, South, and West. Three guys who you do need to be aware of because they're going to keep coming up. They're going to have a lot of influence in the next 20 years or so of American politics, and as we continue up even to the Civil War for some of them. You need to be aware of these three people, and I want you to be aware of where they come from and what they were calling for. They were all members of the House of Representatives. So they were all elected to the House. Remember, the House is one of the houses of Congress. The Senate is the one with the equal representation, which made the small states happy. The House is the one with proportional representation, which made the larger states happy. So I want you to remember Henry Clay's name. Clay and Calhoun should seem vaguely familiar to you because you know that those were the two guys who really put forth that states' rights doctrine, that idea that the states were allowed to nullify or cancel laws that were unconstitutional or that weren't or then later it's going to be that aren't beneficial to their particular region. So Clay's from the West. He's from Kentucky. Remember, that's kind of considered the West at this point, as westy as we have of states. And he's especially going to be calling for roads and canals for transporting goods. That shouldn't surprise you because we talked about how a big part of the reason that we wanted control of the Mississippi River is so we could use it for transportation. But he's also going to call for roads. And remember, I told you the only way roads get built is when governments tax people to get the money to build them, because no one is going to just volunteer up their hard-earned money in order to build roads. Remember how Jefferson felt about that. Jefferson didn't want government to do anything except keep people from hurting each other, not take from the mouth of labor the bread that it has earned. So you know he wasn't a high taxes kind of guy. Calhoun, which I'm sorry, he just looks a lot like Henry Clay with a different hairstyle, but that's not the point. Calhoun is a Southerner, and he's going to become very important. He's from South Carolina, and he's going to stay very, very staunchly or passionately an advocate of states' rights. So remember his name. He's one of the two guys that when Jackson was asked what his only regret was from his time in the office, one of his only regrets was that he didn't kill John C. Calhoun when he had the chance. And you're a Northerner, a very kind of stern-looking man, is Daniel Webster. He's from Massachusetts. He's going to become very important in the run-up to the Civil War as well. He was very pro-tariff. Now, remember that originally when we thought, actually the next slide's about tariffs, so I'm not going to say anything because I'm going to end up explaining it again. So just remember that Daniel Webster and the North come to be very pro-tariff because of its effect on American industry. This is only important, and you don't even need to write this down. If you're actually listening to this and you don't have me on mute, you don't need to write this down. I want you to be aware of it because it's going to become really important during Jackson, but it's not worth taking notes on. The charter of the first bank was only 20 years, I believe, and when the charter of that first bank ran out, the bank was no longer, and instead of having a national bank, you had state banks, and because of the actions of state banks, the economy ended up being damaged. So in 1816, the Congress is going to establish the second national bank. It's going to get another 20-year charter. It's privately owned. It's a place that people can invest in the country. Remember, the reason that adults like me and your parents put our money in banks is to keep it safe, but it also then the bank turns around and uses our money to make other investments. So by putting our money in the national bank and by giving wealthy people the opportunity to put their money in the national bank, they're then investing in our country. They're also going to lend money, and you're going to find that the people who really need money lent to them are people starting businesses. So think North. They're also going to control the money supply and make sure that we don't fall victim to inflation. So just be aware that we charter a second bank. Now let's talk tariff. I feel like if I explain tariffs enough times, they will eventually sink in. It's kind of like mercantilism in the early time when I kept explaining mercantilism, which, by the way, remember, is the idea that colonies, we really want to have colonies because colonies exist solely to provide raw materials which belong to the home country. So tariffs. We've talked about duties as being taxes on imported goods that are used kind of to raise money, but a protective tariff is a similar idea. It's a tax on imports. But look at the image and I'll explain to you how that works. This is the same one we looked at in that other video. So you've got, in Great Britain, they are making cloth, and they are making cloth for $5 per roll, and they could sell it to you for $5 per roll. In the United States, you have cloth being made, as we have the rise of manufacturing in New England. You have cloth being created, but it costs $6 per roll. And the reason for that is not that the United States is trying to price gouge. The reason is that the United States doesn't have the same level of factories. They don't have the experienced workers. They don't have the same effective manufacturing practices which allow you to make things on the cheap. So theirs is going to cost $6. Britain's is going to cost $5. Of course, consumers are going to buy Britain's. Consumers want cheap prices. So the purpose of a tariff in this respect is to make the foreign good more expensive so that people will buy American. You've heard that phrase of buy American, buy domestic. So in this case, when we have a tariff that's protecting, it's protecting American manufacturing because it's encouraging people to buy their home product by making the other one more expensive. Now, this makes British-made cloth cost $6.25, and now American-made cloth is going to cost $6. So if I'm a consumer, I'm going to buy American. But here's the problem with that. that's expensive. Why did we do this? If you're a Southerner who's not making money off this, if you're not a manufacturer who's making money off this, then you're mad because you could have gotten it for $5. But thanks to this tariff, now you have to pay $6. So keep in mind that not everybody's going to be thrilled about this. I just said all of that. Hey, I just said all of that. It's going to have the effect of raising prices, which brings us to Clay's American system. This is the last one. Oh, there it is. Jackson, one of his quotes, he had strong feelings on Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, and we'll get into their little feud in a minute. So generally, the Clay system starts with the idea of being pro-tariff. Even though he is a Westerner, even though he's from Kentucky, he's pro-tariff because he's going to try to convince people that it's going to be good for everyone. His argument is going to be that it is good for the South because now the Northerners will turn around and buy their cloth. So or their cotton. Imagine that I'm a Northerner who's starting to create cloth like this. I'm going to need cotton. So his argument to the South was the more cloth they're creating, the more cotton they'll need from you. So it's going to make you rich too. Obviously, you know that Clay is a Westerner, and you know that Westerners really want these roads and bridges and canals. These are called public works because public meaning, in this case, referring to the government. The government is going to fund these, and they're going to do it with the revenue they make off of the tariff. These are public works projects. They're infrastructure projects. Infrastructure just refers to the things, usually physical, like roads, bridges, and canals that people use for transportation and use to make a country work. So his argument is that this is going to be good for the West because that money is going to lead to the things that they wanted. Now, this never actually passes. Clay tries repeatedly, but it never actually passes, basically because Southerners are unconvinced that this is actually good for them, and probably with good reason. So when I see you in class, we'll talk about those 3 Supreme Court cases in particular, and then we're going to move quickly into Jackson. So I'll see you in class. Make sure you put in a good summary.